Everyone in Cold Creek knew Gideon Mercer could have any woman he wanted. He was lean, scarred, and sharp-eyed. A man who had outlasted 3 Wyoming winters alone and walked out of the mountains each time without explanation. When he rode into the Ashcroft settlement that April morning, every mother in town straightened her daughter's collar. Clara Ashcroft, the youngest, the prettiest, the one everyone agreed was meant for exactly this kind of moment, smoothed her dress and waited. And then Gideon Mercer looked past her, past all of them, and asked to speak with Maeve, the sister with the bad leg, the one nobody ever waited for. If this story already has your attention, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and make sure you're following so you never miss what comes next. The Ashcroft trading post had been dying for 2 years before anyone said it plainly. Maeve knew. She had known since the winter her father's heart gave out on the loading dock and left behind a ledger full of debts and a family that had no idea how close to the edge they actually stood. She had spent the 22 months since then managing what she could, stretching supplies, renegotiating credit with the freight carriers who passed through Cold Creek on their way to somewhere better, keeping the shelves stocked enough that customers didn't notice how thin things had gotten. She was good at that, making the cracks invisible, making a broken thing look like it was holding together through sheer willpower, which, she supposed, was also a fair description of herself. Her left leg had been damaged since childhood, a fall from a hay wagon at age 7 that had never healed quite right, leaving her with a gait that she had long since stopped apologizing for. Her hands were rough and scarred from years of loading crates and splitting wood and doing the kind of labor that no one ever thought to thank a woman for. She was 26 years old, the older of the 2 Ashcroft daughters, and she had spent so many years being the useful one, the dependable one, the one who held the household together while her mother fretted and her sister grew up lovely and graceful, that she had nearly forgotten she was supposed to want something for herself. Clara was 22 and beautiful in the way that made men slow down when they passed through the front door. Dark hair, light eyes, a laugh that carried across a room without trying. Eleanor Ashcroft had poured everything she had into Clara's future. Not cruelly, Maeve told herself, but practically. Her mother was a practical woman in most things, and the practical reality of their situation was that a good marriage for Clara was the most likely solution to a problem that Maeve's ledger arithmetic could not fully solve on its own. "He's coming tomorrow," Eleanor said that evening, moving around the kitchen with the particular restless energy she got when she was anxious. "Gideon Mercer, I want the place clean. I want Clara in the blue dress." "I heard," Maeve said. She was mending a tear in a canvas supply sack, her needle moving in steady automatic pulls. "He's not a young man, but he's not old either. 33, someone said. He's made a real life out there. Trading routes, trapping, knows the mountain passes better than any man alive. They say he's looking to settle. Get a wife before the next winter." "That's practical of him." Her mother looked at her. "Don't be difficult, Maeve." "I'm not being difficult. I said it's practical." She pulled the thread through. "He sounds like a man who makes sensible decisions." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Clara needs this. We need this." Maeve didn't answer because there wasn't anything useful to say to that. She knew what her mother meant. She also knew that her mother's math, as straightforward as it seemed, left out at least a few important variables. But she wasn't in the mood to argue about things that hadn't happened yet. Gideon Mercer arrived mid-morning on a gray horse that looked as trail-worn as the man himself. He was taller than Maeve expected, lean through the shoulders, built more for endurance than strength, with a face that had been worked over by weather and time until it had settled into something permanent and hard to read. He wore a coat that had been good quality once and had since been repaired in at least 4 places. He carried himself the way men did who had spent long stretches of time alone, not arrogant, but contained, like a person who had learned not to waste motion. Half the women in Cold Creek found reasons to be near the trading post that morning. Maeve noticed them from the window, but didn't remark on it. She had a delivery to sort and invoices to file and no particular interest in performing for an audience. Clara was in the blue dress, her hair done carefully, positioned near the front counter where she would be the first thing a person saw when they came through the door. Eleanor stood nearby, trying to look like she wasn't watching. Maeve stayed in the back. She heard the bell over the door, heard her mother's voice go warm and welcoming, heard Clara's laugh, that easy, carrying laugh. She kept working, running her finger down a column of figures, checking a number twice. Then her mother's voice, different now, tighter, uncertain. "Maeve, can you come out here a moment?" She set her pen down and came through the curtain. Gideon Mercer was standing near the center of the room, holding his hat in both hands. He had the look of a man who had made a decision and was prepared for it to be unwelcome. Clara was off to the side, her expression hard to read. Confused, maybe. Eleanor looked like she'd bitten into something unexpected. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, and it took Maeve a half-second to realize he was talking to her. Not to Clara, to her. "Yes," she said carefully. "My name's Gideon Mercer. I've been asking around town about the Ashcroft family. I'd like to ask your mother's permission to call on you, if that's agreeable." The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to be deeply uncomfortable. "Me?" Maeve said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him with the same flat assessment she gave freight invoices that didn't add up. He looked back without flinching. "I'll leave you to speak with my mother," she said, and went back through the curtain. She heard the conversation in pieces, her mother's voice cycling through confusion, cautious politeness, and a kind of suppressed agitation that Maeve recognized well. She heard Clara's heels on the floor as she moved away from the counter. She heard the bell over the door when Gideon Mercer finally left, presumably having gotten whatever answer Eleanor had managed to give him. Then Clara came through the curtain. "He asked for you," Clara said. Her voice was flat. "I know. He barely looked at me." "Clara." "Why? What would he want with you?" She stopped herself, and for a moment her face went complicated, something moving through it that wasn't quite cruelty, just hurt wearing a sharper expression than it meant to. "I don't mean it like that. I don't understand." "Neither do I," Maeve said honestly. Clara left without saying anything else. Maeve heard her on the stairs. Eleanor came through a few minutes later and stood in the doorway, arms folded, expression unreadable. "I told him I'd speak with you first," she said. "That's fair. He's a serious man, Maeve. Knows what he's about. I'll grant him that." She paused. "He's not what I planned." "No," Maeve agreed. "He's not. But he's real. What he has is real." Another pause. "I told him you'd walk with him tomorrow morning, if you're willing." Maeve turned back to her figures. She thought about the ledger. She thought about the debts. She thought about Clara's face, and what it cost her mother to say that, and how many years she had been the one doing the necessary thing without being asked. "Fine," she said. "I'll walk with him." Hold on. He was waiting at the edge of the property at 7 in the morning, which she appreciated. It told her he didn't expect to be waited on. They walked along the south fence line, which was the flattest route and the one she'd taken 1,000 times. He matched his pace to hers without comment or ceremony, which she also noted. "You can ask," she said after about 10 minutes of silence. "Ask what?" "Whatever it is you need to know. You came here to evaluate someone. That's fine. Just ask." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you know about the mountain passes west of here?" She looked at him sideways. "That's your first question?" "It's what I need to know." She thought about it. "I know the freight routes. I know the timing. When the early snows usually close the high passes, when they reopen in spring. I've been handling supply orders for this post for 3 years. I know what runs short when supply lines get cut, and I know which goods have the longest shelf life." She paused. "Is that the kind of answer you were looking for?" "More or less." They walked a little further. "Your turn," he said. "My turn for what?" "To ask whatever you need to know." She thought about all the polite questions she could ask, about his home, his plans, his intentions. Then she asked the one that was actually bothering her. "Why not Clara?" He didn't answer right away. She waited. "Your sister's young," he said finally, "and she's been told she's the future of this family her whole life. I could see it from across the room. That kind of expectation changes a person." "And?" And I'm not looking for someone who married a mountain because they had no other choice. I need someone who'd choose it, who's already chosen hard things. He glanced at her. You've been choosing them for years. Anyone with eyes can see that. Maeve said nothing. She was not, she told herself, moved by this. She was considering it carefully, the way she considered freight manifests and seasonal projections. You're not going to tell me that's a pretty thing to say, he asked. It's an accurate thing to say, she said. I don't know that it's pretty. The corner of his mouth shifted, just barely. The town noticed. The town always noticed. By that evening, the story of Gideon Mercer's unexpected choice had made the full circuit of Cold Creek, and the reaction was about what Maeve might have predicted if she'd cared to predict it. Mildred Crane, who ran the laundry and had an opinion about everything, said it openly at the dry goods store. Can't imagine what he's thinking. The girl limps. She's not exactly... And then she'd seemed to remember herself and finished with, what a man usually looks for. Harlan Fitch, who had been trying to court Clara for 2 years without success, was less measured. He cornered Maeve near the post office and said with genuine bewilderment, He picked you over Clara. Apparently, Maeve said, and kept walking. I don't mean offense. I know you don't, she said, which was not quite the same as saying he hadn't given any. At home, the atmosphere was its own kind of weather. Eleanor was making her peace with it, in the way she made peace with most things she didn't expect. Quietly, with a great deal of rearranging of small objects and careful avoidance of direct conversation. Clara had retreated into a chill that she maintained with perfect surface courtesy and absolute emotional absence. She passed Maeve the bread at dinner. She said goodnight. She did not say anything else. Maeve didn't blame her. She also didn't know how to fix it, and she had learned long ago not to spend energy on problems that weren't ready to be solved. Gideon called 3 more times over the following week. He was consistent, which she was beginning to understand was probably the most reliable thing about him. On the second visit, they sat on the porch, and he told her, with no particular drama, what life at the homestead actually involved. The square footage of the cabin, which was modest. The location, which was 2 days' ride from the nearest settlement. The state of the root cellar, which was adequate but needed expansion. The trapping roots, which were his primary income. The gardens, which had been inconsistent because he'd been managing them alone. He spoke about all of this the way a person presented a business arrangement, and Maeve listened and asked practical questions. And at the end of it, she understood precisely what she was being offered and precisely what would be expected of her. No one had ever spoken to her quite that honestly before. She wasn't sure if she found it appealing or alarming. On the third visit, he brought a list of the supplies he was planning to acquire before heading back into the mountains, and she looked it over and told him he was underestimating his flour by 1/3 and missing 3 items she would consider essential. He pulled out a pencil and added them without argument. You're not going to tell me I'm wrong? She asked. You know supply better than I do, he said simply. Why would I argue with that? She handed the list back. On the 4th visit, he asked her to marry him. He did it standing in the trading post's back room, surrounded by crates of dry goods and bolts of fabric, while she was in the middle of inventory. He said, I think you already know what I'm going to say and what I'm asking. I think you've been deciding since the first walk. I just want to ask plainly. Maeve set down her counting pen. She thought about the debts and the ledger and her mother's careful, quiet anxiety. She thought about Clara's cold silence at the dinner table and the way Harlan Fitch had looked at her like she was a problem he couldn't solve. She thought about the list of supplies and the root cellar that needed expansion, and a man who had added 3 items to his list without argument because she knew the work better than he did. She thought about what it had felt like, for one brief, strange morning, to be the one someone had chosen. Not by default. Not out of necessity. Chosen. Yes, she said. I'll marry you. He nodded once, the same way he'd nodded when she corrected the flour estimate. We'll need to sort the formal arrangements with your mother, he said. I know. And I'd like to leave before the late spring rains close the Eastern Trail. That gives us about 3 weeks. Is that enough time? She looked around the back room, at the shelves she'd organized, the invoices she'd filed, the 3 years of her life quietly embedded in this particular set of walls. It'll have to be, she said. He left. Maeve stood alone for a moment in the back room, listening to the quiet. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the inventory, because there was still work to be done, and she was, above all else, a woman who finished what she started. Outside, Cold Creek went on the way it always did, talking, doubting, misunderstanding. But in 3 weeks, she would be gone, and the mountains would not care about any of it. The wedding was not a celebration so much as a transaction conducted in the presence of witnesses. Maeve had not expected more than that, and she told herself she wasn't disappointed. The ceremony took place in the front room of the trading post on a Tuesday morning, performed by Justice Caldwell, who smelled of pipe smoke and spoke in the unhurried monotone of a man who had done this too many times to find it remarkable. Eleanor wore her good dress and kept her expression composed through the whole of it. Clara stood at the edge of the room in a posture that managed to be both physically present and entirely elsewhere, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Maeve's left shoulder. Gideon stood beside Maeve in his best coat, the one with only 2 visible repairs. And when the moment came to speak, he spoke clearly and without hesitation. Maeve did the same. She signed her name on the certificate with the same firm, economical hand she used for freight invoices, because it was her hand, and it was the only one she had. Afterward, Eleanor embraced her. It was a brief embrace, tight and a little desperate, and she said into Maeve's hair, "You write. You send letters when you can." "I will," Maeve said. Clara hugged her too, which surprised her. It was an awkward hug, the kind 2 people manage when they haven't yet decided whether they're angry at each other or not. Clara pulled back and looked at her directly for the first time in 3 weeks. "I hope it's good," Clara said, and Maeve could hear that she meant it, underneath everything else she also felt. "I'll try to make it good," Maeve said, which was the most honest answer she had. They loaded the wagon before noon. Maeve's belongings amounted to 2 trunks and a crate of supplies she'd pulled from the trading post inventory, things her mother couldn't really spare but had pressed on her anyway. Gideon loaded everything without comment, arranged it efficiently in the wagon bed, and checked the horse's harness twice. He did not rush her. When she climbed up onto the seat, she did not look back at the trading post. Not because leaving didn't cost her anything, but because she had learned a long time ago that looking back at a thing you couldn't change was mostly just a way of hurting yourself for no reason. They were 2 miles out of Cold Creek when Gideon said, "You can look back if you want. It doesn't mean anything." "I know it doesn't," she said. He said nothing else, and she was grateful for that. The trail west was not what anyone would call comfortable, and Maeve did not pretend otherwise, even to herself. The first day was manageable. Flat terrain, decent track, the kind of traveling that wore on a person steadily without delivering any single dramatic blow. Her leg ached by mid-afternoon, as it usually did after extended sitting in an awkward position, and she shifted as best she could on the wagon bench without drawing attention to it. Gideon noticed anyway. She could tell by the way he found a reason to stop near a creek around the 3rd hour. "Horse needs water," he said, which was true enough. And the way he climbed down first and offered his hand when she followed. She took it. She was practical enough not to refuse useful help on account of pride. The second day the terrain changed. The trail climbed, narrowed, wound through stretches of pine and granite that were genuinely beautiful and completely indifferent to how tired a person might be. Gideon handled the horses with the casual competence of someone who had made this particular passage enough times that he no longer had to think much about it. He pointed out landmarks as they passed, a rockfall that had come down 2 winters ago and changed the path, a creek crossing that was straightforward now but murderous in spring runoff, a stand of dead trees that marked where he'd once had to camp for 4 days waiting out a storm. "You count your days out here," she said. "You count everything," he said. "Days, supplies, weather signs, distance to shelter." He glanced at her. "You already do that, just with different things." Supply chain math isn't quite the same as wilderness survival. It's closer than you'd think. Both of them come down to knowing what you have, what you need, and how long you've got to make the gap work. She thought about that for a while. It wasn't an unreasonable way to put it. Brah! The homestead was not what she had imagined, although she had deliberately tried not to imagine it too specifically, knowing that expectations were just disappointments waiting for a date. It was a cabin, Solid, low-roofed, well-built in the ways that mattered, and unfinished in the ways that hadn't killed anyone yet. The root cellar was exactly as described, adequate and in need of expansion. The garden plot was visible on the south side, last year's dead growth still standing in matted, frost-killed rows. There was a lean-to attached to the east wall that housed the tools and smelled of pine resin and old leather. A storage shed stood about 20 yards out, its door hanging at a slight angle from a hinge that needed replacing. Maeve stood in the yard and looked at all of it for a moment. She made a mental list. It was a long list, but not an impossible one. "Go ahead," Gideon said from behind her. "Go ahead and what?" "Say whatever you're thinking." "I'm thinking the south garden needs to be broken up and reseeded before the ground gets too warm. The root cellar needs about another 6 feet dug out before next winter. The shed hinge is a one-afternoon fix, and I'd want to know what the drainage situation is like on the north side before the rainy season." He was quiet for a second. "That's roughly my list, too." "Then we're starting from the same place," she said, and went inside to see what the cabin looked like. The first weeks were full of the particular difficulty of learning how to share a space with a person you didn't yet know well enough to anticipate. Gideon was an early riser, earlier than her, which she hadn't expected. He was quiet in the mornings, in a way that she initially read as coldness, and later understood was simply how he came back to himself after sleep. Gradually, carefully, with coffee and about 40 minutes of silence before he was ready to talk to anyone. Once she understood that, she stopped trying to fill the morning quiet and found that she didn't mind it. She had her own version of that, she realized. The first half hour of her day had always been for her ledger work, her mental accounting of what needed doing, and having that space without someone expecting conversation was something she hadn't known she'd been missing. He was a competent cook in the narrow sense of someone who could keep themselves alive but had never needed to feed another person. His bread was dense and slightly underseasoned. His beans were reliable. He had no opinion about variety because he had not had the luxury of it. Maeve was not a gifted cook either, but she was an organized one, and within 2 weeks she had the stores arranged in a way that let her plan meals 3 days out, rather than improvising from whatever was most accessible, which was the approach Gideon had been using, and which produced a great deal of bread and beans. "This is better," he said one evening, over a venison stew with dried vegetables that she had managed to produce from ingredients he'd had sitting in the root cellar for 6 months, apparently untouched. "You had everything for it," she said. "You just hadn't put it together." "That's going to be a recurring theme, I suspect," he said, without any particular irony, and she found herself almost smiling. They worked beside each other on the cabin repairs. The hinge, a section of roof that was soft in one corner, the south garden. He did not condescend to her about physical limitations, and she did not overstate what she could manage. When a job required more leverage than her leg would let her comfortably sustain, she said so, and they found a different way. When a job required her to sit and work with her hands rather than stand, she did it longer and more precisely than he would have, and he acknowledged that without making it a larger thing than it was. It was not romantic. She had not expected it to be romantic. What it was most of the time was functional, and she was beginning to understand that functional had its own kind of value that people who hadn't needed it badly enough didn't always recognize. Cold Creek reached them at the end of the 3rd week in the form of a letter from Eleanor, carried by a freight rider heading west. Maeve read it alone, sitting on the step of the lean-to while Gideon was out checking the trapping lines. Her mother wrote in the careful, slightly formal hand of a woman who had been taught penmanship as a serious subject and never quite lost the formal posture of it. She wrote about the trading post. 2 new accounts, a broken window in the storeroom, a dispute with a freight carrier over a shortfall in a delivery. She wrote about Clara. "She is well and keeping busy, which is the best I can say at the moment." She did not write anything that was not practical information, which was, Maeve reflected, exactly how Eleanor processed difficulty, by keeping the report clean and the emotions off the page. At the very end, almost as a postscript, her mother had written, "People here have a great deal of opinions about Mr. Mercer's choice. I have found it best not to engage with opinions that have not been invited." Maeve folded the letter and held it in her lap for a moment. She knew what was being said back in Cold Creek. She had known what would be said. There was Mildred Crane and her laundry counter commentary. There was Harlan Fitch and his bewildered arithmetic. There were the women who had straightened their daughters' collars the morning Gideon rode in, who were now managing whatever combination of confusion and pity and satisfaction people came to when the world did something they hadn't predicted. She set the letter aside and went back inside to start on the afternoon work, because the afternoon work did not care what Cold Creek thought, and neither, she had decided, did she. What she had not prepared for was the moment the facade cracked. It happened on a Friday evening near the end of their first month, over nothing in particular. She had been trying to repair a section of the garden fence that kept sagging, working at an awkward angle that her leg did not tolerate well after a certain point, and she had pushed past that point because she wanted the thing finished. When she finally came inside, she was tired in the bone-deep way that wasn't fixed by sitting down, and Gideon said, in a completely ordinary tone, "You overdid it again." "I got it done," she said. "You also have been limping worse for the last hour. My leg is my business. When it affects what you can do tomorrow, it affects both of us." She turned around. "I have been managing this leg for 19 years without your input. I know exactly what I overdid and what I didn't, and I would appreciate not being told to take better care of myself by someone who regularly goes into mountain passes alone in November." He looked at her steadily. "Fair point," he said after a pause. "Thank you. The November trips are a reasonable concern, for what it's worth." "I know they are," she said in a slightly less sharp voice. "I've been not saying that for a month." He almost smiled. "Not quite. You can say things, Maeve. So can you." "I'm aware." He set down the leather strap he'd been working on. "I don't say much that isn't necessary because I spent a lot of years where talking didn't accomplish anything." She sat down across the table from him. Her leg was throbbing steadily. "What did accomplish things?" "Moving, working, not stopping." "And you think I'm different from that?" "I think you do the same thing and call it by a different name." He picked the leather back up. "We're more alike in the wrong places than either of us probably wanted." She didn't answer that immediately because she didn't have a clean response to it. It was too accurate to dismiss and too uncomfortable to simply agree with. "My leg isn't going to get better," she said after a while. "Whatever you might be hoping, I'm not hoping anything about your leg," he said. "I asked about the fence because I need the fence done, and I also need you functional tomorrow. That's all." "That's very practical." "Yes," he said simply. She looked at him across the table, at the flat, careful honesty of his face, at a man who had apparently meant exactly what he said from the very beginning and had simply been waiting to see if she was going to believe it. "The root cellar," she said. "I want to start on the expansion before the ground gets harder." "I'll mark it out tomorrow," he said. And that was that. Which was, she was slowly accepting how things went between them, not smoothly, not without friction, but forward. Always forward, because there wasn't anything behind them worth going back to. The town's opinion arrived in person on a Wednesday afternoon in the form of two women Maeve vaguely knew, Ruth Packard and her sister-in-law Josephine, who were making a supply run to a settlement 15 miles further west, and had, they said, taken a small detour to check in on the newlyweds. Maeve gave them coffee and answered their questions with the same polite brevity she used for every kind of performance. The cabin was comfortable. Yes, the journey had been long. Yes, Gideon was well. No, it had been no trouble at all getting settled. Josephine kept looking around the cabin with the eyes of someone cataloging evidence for a report she would give later. Ruth was kinder, but no less curious, and about 20 minutes in she said, with the careful brightness of someone approaching a delicate subject, "We were all so surprised, I'll be honest. When Mr. Mercer came through Cold Creek and, well, most people expected—" "Clara," Maeve said. Ruth blinked. "I suppose so, yes." "Most people were wrong," Maeve said pleasantly. "It happens." Ruth laughed a little nervously. "You seem very settled, very confident about all of it." "I wouldn't say confident," Maeve said. "I'd say committed. They're not the same thing, but one of them is more useful out here." After they left, she stood in the yard and watched their wagon diminish down the trail and felt something settle in her chest that might have been satisfaction or might have been something quieter and less nameable. The feeling of a person who has said the true thing out loud for the first time and discovered that it held. Gideon came around the side of the cabin from the direction of the shed, wiping his hands on a rag. They gone? Yes. Report back to town? Without question. She turned towards the garden. Did you fix the shed hinge? Mostly, he said. The wood around it is soft. I need to replace the whole section. Add it to the list. It's on the list. She almost smiled. Good, she said, and went back to work. The list was long. The days were hard and mostly unremarkable in the way that hard work tends to be. Not dramatic, just heavy, requiring the same effort over and over without much acknowledgement. But there was something in that repetition that Maeve hadn't expected, a growing sense of territory. Of ground that was hers because she had worked it and knew it and understood where its soft spots were. The trading post had never quite felt that way. She had tended it, maintained it, held it together, but it had always been her father's shape, her mother's dream, the thing she'd kept alive for someone else's sake. This was different. She couldn't have said exactly when the shift happened. It wasn't a single moment. It was more like the way the garden responded to a second turning of the soil, something that had been compressed and depleted beginning slowly to open up. By the end of the second month, she had expanded the root cellar by 4 feet, reorganized the storage shed, established a planting schedule for the south garden, and set up a rudimentary bookkeeping system for Gideon's trade inventory that he admitted with characteristic understatement was an improvement over his previous method, which had been memory and a few notes scratched on the inside of a tin lid. She had also, without planning to, begun to trust him. Not completely. Not in the way that came from years of accumulated evidence, but in the provisional, careful way that a practical person extends trust when the evidence so far has been consistent. When a person has said what they meant and meant what they said and shown up the same way enough times that you started to expect it. She didn't say any of this to him. He didn't say anything like it to her either. But one evening, when a late-season cold snap came through and the temperature dropped faster than either of them had expected, Gideon came in from checking the animals and found Maeve already heating water for the warming stones, the extra blankets already pulled from the chest, the gap under the door already stuffed with the rolled canvas she'd made up for exactly this eventuality. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at all of it. Then he said, "When did you make that door draft?" 3 weeks ago, she said. I figured we'd need it eventually. He nodded slowly. Good thinking. It's just practical, she said. I know, he said. That's what I said. She looked up at him, and something passed between them that was not romantic exactly. Not the kind of thing that got written about in the novels Clara used to hide under her mattress. It was closer to recognition. The specific, unglamorous recognition of 2 people who had independently been preparing for the same hard thing and had just discovered they were no longer doing it alone. That was not nothing. In the Wyoming Territory in the year 1857, with the mountains at their back and winter coming, that was, in fact, quite a lot. The fever came without warning, the way the worst things always do. It was late August, almost 4 months after they'd arrived at the homestead, and the days had settled into the particular rhythm of people who have figured out how to share a life without too much friction, not comfortably exactly, but competently. The garden had come in better than either of them had expected. The root cellar extension was finished and stocked. Gideon had made 2 successful runs on the northern trade route and come back both times with enough to cover their winter stores and a modest surplus. Maeve had established a running account with a freight rider named Caswell, who passed through every 3 weeks, which meant they had reliable communication with the outside world, and more practically, reliable access to goods she could not produce from the homestead alone. It was not a perfect life. It was a functional one, and she had learned to locate the value in that. The morning it started, she thought it was ordinary tiredness. She had been up late the night before working on the inventory ledger by lamplight, and she had a headache behind her eyes that she attributed to that. She made the morning coffee. She ate. She went out to check on the garden, which needed its 3rd weeding of the season. By mid-morning, she was back inside, sitting on the edge of the bed, which was not something she did in the middle of the day. By afternoon, she had a fever high enough that when Gideon came back from checking the trap lines and put his hand on her forehead, His expression did something she had never seen it do before. He went still in the way that people go still when they are controlling a response that would otherwise show on their face. "How long?" he asked. "Since this morning. I thought it was just a headache." "It's not a headache," he said. He was already moving, going to the supply shelf where she kept the medicinal stores. The herbs and tinctures she'd insisted on packing from the trading post over her mother's mild protest that she was being excessive. She had not been excessive. She had, as it turned out, been correct. He brought her yarrow tea because she told him to, and a damp cloth for her head because she told him that too, and she lay back on the bed and felt the particular indignity of being sick, the way it stripped a person down to something helpless and undignified and stripped of all the usefulness they'd spent years building up around themselves like a wall. "I'll be better by tomorrow," she said. Gideon sat on the chair beside the bed and said nothing. "I just need to sleep it off." "Maybe," he said. "You have the northern route run in 4 days." "I know. The Caswell contact is expecting you to have the marten pelts ready." "Maeve," he said, "stop." She stopped. The room had developed a slow, unpleasant tilt. She closed her eyes. She was not better by tomorrow. By the second day, the fever had climbed. She knew this not from a thermometer, which they did not have, but from the quality of the heat, the way it moved from the surface of her skin down into her joints, the way her hands felt clumsy and distant, the way time had started losing its clean edges. She was aware enough, in her clearer moments, to be afraid. Mountain fever was not always survivable. She knew this. She had seen it in Cold Creek, a trapper, 3 years back, who had come in sick and been dead in a week. She knew the stages. She had read about them in the medical almanac she kept in the supply crate, the one her father had owned and she had inherited along with everything else. She was in the early stages, she thought, and early stages could go either way. She told Gideon this, in one of her clearer moments, lying on the bed while he sat in the chair, that she was beginning to think he had not left for any significant length of time. "The Whitmore settlement is 2 days' ride east," she said. "They have a woman there, Martha Yunt, who knows medicine better than anyone in this part of the territory. If you left now, you could be back with her in 4 days." "No," he said. "Gideon, you'd be alone for 4 days with a fever that's still climbing," he said, in the patient, flat tone of a man who has already considered the thing you're about to say and decided against it. "No. I've been alone before. Not like this." She wanted to argue with him, but arguing required energy she didn't have, and somewhere underneath the argument she could feel a part of herself that was simply, without her permission, grateful that he was in that chair. "The trade run," she said. "I sent word with Caswell's boy yesterday. He came through while you were sleeping." He paused. "The pelts will keep. Caswell will adjust." She looked at the ceiling. "You're losing money." "Yes. For a significant amount of time, depending on how long this takes." "Yes." "That's not... Gideon, that's not practical. We agreed on practical." He leaned forward in the chair, his elbows on his knees, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, not because it was blank, but because it had too much in it at once, and she was too sick to untangle all of it. "Go to sleep," he said. She went to sleep, because she didn't have much choice. The storm arrived on the 3rd day. She knew it was there because she could hear it. The particular sound of wind coming off the mountains, not the ordinary evening wind, but the low, continuous moan of something that intended to stay. She could hear rain against the cabin roof, then something harder than rain, and she understood distantly that they were snowed in or close to it, which meant the question of Gideon leaving for help had resolved itself into an answer she hadn't provided. She was, for stretches of the next 2 days, not entirely present. She knew that Gideon was there. She knew it the way a person knows certain things in a compromised state, not through clear observation, but through something more primitive, a persistent awareness at the edge of consciousness. He was there when she woke shaking. He was there when the fever spiked bad enough that she said things she would not remember later. She knew she said things she would not remember because she could see it in his face afterward, a controlled, deliberate neutrality that people put on when they've witnessed something private and are choosing to respect it. At one point, she surfaced enough to find him sitting at the foot of the bed rather than the chair, his back against the wall, his eyes open in the dark. She didn't know what time it was. "You should sleep," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "I slept earlier." "You're watching me." "Yes." "That's not necessary." "I'm aware," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." She thought about telling him again that it wasn't necessary, and didn't. She looked at the ceiling, at the dark shape of the roof beams, and listened to the storm doing its slow, grinding work outside. "I'm not going to die," she said. She said it not because she was certain of it, but because she needed to hear it said plainly. "No," he agreed. "You're not." "You don't know that." "I know you," he said. That was all he said. She turned it over in her mind for a while, the particular weight of it, coming from a man who said almost nothing that wasn't necessary. She closed her eyes. The fever broke on the 6th day. She knew it when she woke because the quality of the light was different, cleaner, somehow, as though someone had taken a film off the window, and because for the first time in nearly a week, she was cold rather than hot. Properly cold, the good kind, her body having apparently decided it was done fighting at that particular temperature and ready to come back to something reasonable. She sat up slowly. The room held its shape. Gideon was asleep in the chair, his head at an angle that was going to cause him real neck pain when he woke up. His coat was around his shoulders. There were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there before, and a scruff of beard that had grown in unevenly, and he looked. She studied him for a moment with the particular clarity that comes after a bad illness, when everything seems lit from a slightly different angle. He looked exhausted in the specific way of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has not allowed themselves to show it. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at him for a while. She had come to this marriage knowing exactly what it was. She had signed her name on that certificate with the same hand she used for freight invoices, and she had meant the comparison. Deliberate, practical, unsentimental. She had liked Gideon because he was honest and because he hadn't condescended to her, and because he'd added 3 items to a supply list without argument. These were not the things that made a person love another person, she had told herself. These were the things that made a person a reliable partner, which was different, and in the Wyoming territory, arguably more important. She was no longer entirely sure that was true. She got up carefully, her legs were weak, and the world had that slightly too bright quality of early recovery, and put another piece of wood on the fire because the storm had broken, but the cold had stayed, and because doing something with her hands helped her think. Gideon woke up when she was filling the kettle. She heard him shift, heard the chair creak, heard the small involuntary sound of a man straightening a neck that had been crooked all night. "You're up," he said. The fever broke. A pause. Then, in a voice he hadn't used before, lower, stripped of its usual careful control. "When?" "This morning, sometime before light." She set the kettle on the hook. "I'm all right, Gideon." He didn't say anything. She turned around and found him sitting forward in the chair with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, not weeping. He was not a man who wept, but holding still in the posture of someone letting something go that they've been carrying for a long time. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the table nearest him, not touching, just closer. "I'm all right," she said again, more quietly. He lifted his head. His eyes were dry and his face was back to its usual arrangement, mostly, except around the edges. "I know," he said. "You didn't sleep." "Some." "You've been in that chair for 6 days." "Not the whole time." A pause. "Most of it." She looked at him. "The trade run, Maeve." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. "If you say trade run to me right now, I am going to walk out and chop wood until I feel better about it." She almost laughed. She was genuinely surprised by the almost laugh. It came up from somewhere unexpected, unexpected enough that she pressed her lips together to keep it from becoming something more unruly than the situation called for. "All right," she said. "I won't say trade run. Thank you. I was going to say we need breakfast." He looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his face. Not the almost smile she'd seen a few times before, but something fuller and less controlled, there and then gone. "I'll make the bread," he said, and got up from the chair. His recovery was slow and irritating in the way recovery always was. The body coming back online in pieces, appetite arriving before strength, sleep patterns still confused for almost a week after the fever broke. Maeve was not a patient, which surprised no one, including herself. She tried to resume normal work on the third day of recovery and made it about 2 hours before Gideon appeared at her elbow and said, without any particular drama, "You're pale." "I'm always pale." "You're a different kind of pale. Go sit down." "The inventory. We'll be there tomorrow," he said. "Go. Sit." She sat because her legs had in fact been making a compelling argument in that direction for the past 20 minutes. She sat on the step of the lean-to in the thin autumn sunlight and watched him finish the task she'd been doing, and felt the particular frustrated helplessness of a person who defines themselves by their usefulness being temporarily removed from their usefulness. He came and sat beside her after a while. They didn't talk for several minutes. A hawk turned slow circles above the tree line to the north. The sky was the hard, clear blue that came after storms in this part of the territory. "I need to tell you something," Gideon said. She waited. "I went into this the way I go into most things," he said. "With a plan. Practical assessment, right decision, execute and move forward." He was quiet for a moment. "I told myself what I told you, that I needed a partner who could handle the life out here. That's true. That's still true. But," she said, "but I've been sitting with the fact that for about 4 days, somewhere in the middle of all of that, I stopped thinking about the homestead." He said it with the flat, slightly uncomfortable candor of a man admitting something he'd rather have kept to himself. "I wasn't thinking about the trapping routes or the winter stores or the trade contract with Caswell. I was thinking about you, just you, whether you were going to wake up." The hawk banked and disappeared behind the tree line. "I don't know what to do with that," he said. "I'm telling you because I think you should know. I'm not telling you because I expect anything back." Maeve looked at her hands, the scarred knuckles, the rough palms, the hands she'd had all her life and had stopped being self-conscious about somewhere around age 14 because there was too much work to do to spend time being self-conscious. "I made a very deliberate decision to marry you," she said slowly. "I knew what it was. I knew what I was signing up for." She paused. "I want you to know that I've been revising that understanding since we got here, incrementally." She stopped. "This is not something I say easily." "I know," he said. I'm not saying." She stopped again because what she was trying to say was tangled up in years of being the useful one, the practical one, the one who didn't make demands on other people's feelings because she'd learned early that her own feelings were not the priority. "You don't have to say anything else," Gideon said. "I just needed you to know." She nodded. They sat in the thin sunlight, not touching, not talking, while the cold came down slowly from the mountains. It was not a romantic moment in any of the ways that word usually implied. It was more awkward than that, and more real. After a while, she said, "The root cellar temperature dropped 2 degrees while I was sick. I want to check the seal on the north wall." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. They sat a little longer. The afternoon light moved across the yard and touched the roof of the shed in the corner of the garden, turning everything briefly golden in the way that late autumn light did before it gave up entirely. Maeve felt the warmth of it on her face and did not move away from it. She had come out here knowing exactly what this was. She had been so sure of that. She was not sure of it anymore. And she found, sitting in the last thin warmth of a Wyoming afternoon next to a man who had stayed in a chair for 6 days because he couldn't make himself leave, that she was not particularly sorry to have been wrong. Winter came to the Wyoming territory that year with the particular cruelty of a season that had been holding back and finally decided to stop. The first serious snow fell in early November, 2 weeks after Maeve was fully back on her feet, and it did not stop for 3 days. When it finally lifted, the world outside the cabin windows was white in every direction. Not the picturesque white of something pretty, but the flat, serious white of something that intended to kill anything that wasn't prepared for it. Gideon had been preparing for exactly this since before Maeve arrived, and Maeve had been adding her own preparations to his since the week she'd unpacked her trunks. And so the two of them sat on opposite sides of the table the morning after the snow stopped and went through the winter inventory together, the way they went through most serious things, methodically, without drama, calling the numbers what they were. The numbers were adequate, not comfortable, but adequate. "Flour will stretch to March if we're careful," Maeve said, running her finger down the column. "The venison in the cellar is good, salt stock is fine. I'm less certain about the medicinal supplies. We went through more than I'd planned." She said it neutrally, but they both knew what she was referring to. "I'll get more through Caswell in the spring," Gideon said. "Make a list of what we need most." "I already have one." "Of course you do." She looked up. He said it without irony, with the particular quiet that had become, over the course of their months together, something she recognized as his version of warmth. She went back to the column. The winter settled in around them, and they settled into it. What? There was a different quality to the months after the fever. Not dramatic, not transformed in the way that stories sometimes implied, but altered in some quieter and more durable way. The careful distance that had characterized their first weeks together had compressed into something closer. Not without friction. They were both too accustomed to their own judgment to agree on everything. And there were arguments, the practical kind that came from two people with strong opinions about how a thing should be done, and occasionally the less practical kind that came from tiredness and close quarters, and the accumulated pressure of a Wyoming winter. But the arguments resolved. Neither of them was given to prolonged grievance, which turned out to be one of the more underrated qualities a person could have. What changed most, Maeve thought, was the silence. Early on, the silences between them had been neutral at best, awkward at worst. The silences of two strangers being careful around each other. Now they were something else. She could sit across the table from Gideon in the evening while he worked on harness repair, and she worked on the ledger, and the quiet between them was simply quiet. Not weighted with anything that needed to be said. Not a failure of conversation, but the absence of one that wasn't necessary. She had not known, before this, that that particular kind of quiet existed. She found she valued it. She also found that she had been wrong about something she'd believed for most of her adult life, which was that the most reliable form of belonging came from being useful. From being the one who held things together, who solved the problems, who stayed when everyone else had the luxury of leaving. She had built her entire sense of herself around that, and it wasn't false. Usefulness was real, and she was genuinely good at it, and it had kept her family and then her marriage functional in ways that mattered. But lying in that bed for 6 days with a fever she couldn't work her way out of, watching Gideon stay in that chair for reasons that had nothing to do with her usefulness, she had understood something she hadn't quite let herself understand before. Being wanted for what you could do and being wanted for what you were not the same thing, and she had only ever been offered the first kind until now. She did not say any of this to Gideon. He knew it already, she thought, in the way he knew most things. Not through conversation, but through careful, sustained attention. Spring arrived the way it always did in that part of the territory, grudgingly, in stages, with setbacks. There was a false thaw in late February that raised everyone's hopes, and then a hard frost in early March that punished them for hoping, and then a genuine, committed warming that began sometime in the third week of March, and continued until the snow was gone from everything but the highest peaks, and the ground had softened enough to work. Gideon left on the first trade run of the season in April, heading north to the established trapping routes he'd been running for 7 years. He would be gone 3 weeks. They had discussed this extensively over the winter, the route, the timing, the contacts he'd be meeting, the goods he was carrying, what to do if the weather turned. The morning he left, she checked his supply pack herself, going through it item by item while he held the horse and waited without impatience. "You put in the extra fire-starting kit," he said, watching her. "The one you had was getting low." "I know. I put in a new one last night." She found it at the bottom of the pack. "Oh." She straightened up. "Fine. You're set." "I know I'm set." He took the pack back and secured it to the saddle. The Caswell rider comes through in 10 days. I've already left word. He'll stop even if you don't flag him. I know. The door on the storage shed is still stiff. I didn't get to finish planing it down. Gideon, she said, I have been managing things since before you knew I existed. I will manage for 3 weeks. He looked at her. I know that, he said. I'm not worried about you managing. Then what are you doing? A pause. Talking, he said, because I don't particularly want to leave. She looked at him for a moment. The morning was cold and clear, the light still new, the mountains visible to the west in that sharp, particular way they got when the air was clean. Then come back quickly, she said. He nodded, mounted, and rode north without looking back, which she understood because she was the same way, and she watched him until the trail bent and he disappeared into the tree line, and then she went back inside and started her day. He came back in 18 days, which was 5 days early, and he came back with something she hadn't expected, a proposition. He spread a rough map on the table their first evening back together, a map of the territory, hand-drawn, with the trade routes marked in his spare, functional penmanship, and told her what he'd found. There was a relay point, he explained, roughly a day's ride east of their homestead on the main trail between Cold Creek and the northern settlements. The man who had been running it, a trader named Pollard, had died over the winter. The relay point had been a way station, a place where travelers could stop, rest, water horses, buy basic supplies. It wasn't a large operation, but it sat on a section of trail that was getting heavier traffic every season as more settlers moved west, and the nearest alternative stop was 3 hours further than anyone wanted to push in bad weather. It needs someone who understands supply, he said. Someone who can keep stock organized, know what travelers need, manage the accounts. Maeve was quiet, looking at the map. It's a half-day ride from here, he continued. It wouldn't have to be permanent. We could run it seasonally, spring through fall when traffic is high. Winter, we pull back here. You'd still run the northern routes? Adjusted routes. I've already been thinking about it. There are past connections I haven't fully used because I didn't have a fixed point to route back to. He put his finger on the map. If we anchor here, the whole network makes more sense. She looked at where his finger was. She looked at the route lines radiating outward. You've been planning this since before the winter, she said. Since October, he admitted. I wanted to see how the winter went first. She looked up at him. You wanted to see how I went. I wanted to see how we went, he said, which was the more accurate version and the more honest one, and she appreciated that he gave it to her. She looked back at the map. She thought about the trading post in Cold Creek, the shelves she'd organized, the accounts she'd kept, the 3 years of her life embedded in those walls for someone else's survival. She thought about what it would mean to do that same work for something that was hers, theirs. The structure would need to be expanded, she said. You'd need proper storage, a root cellar on site, or at minimum a weatherproof cache, and you'd need consistent supply lines, not just whatever Caswell can manage. I've been working on that. I'd want to see the building before we commit to anything. I thought we'd ride out next week. She looked at the map one more time, then she nodded. All right, she said. Show me what you found. The relay station was a rougher thing in person than it had sounded in description. A low building with a sagging roof section and a storage area that had clearly been organized by a man with no system. But the bones of it were sound, and the location was exactly what Gideon had said. She stood in the doorway and looked at the trail in both directions and counted 3 distinct groups of travelers passing within the 2 hours they were there. A family in a heavily loaded wagon heading west, 2 freight riders going north, and a lone trapper who stopped to water his horse and asked, with some annoyance, where Pollard had gotten to. He passed over the winter, Gideon told him. The trapper looked at the closed building. Damn, he said, with the particular frustration of someone who had been counting on a thing and found it gone. I've got another 6 hours before the next stop. Maeve had brought a small pack with supplies for their own travel. She opened it, pulled out a portion of dried venison and a sealed tin of hardtack, and held it out to the trapper without any particular ceremony. He looked at it, then at her. I can pay. 10 cents, she said. He paid. He rode on. Maeve looked at the 10 cents in her hand for a moment, then at the empty building, then at Gideon. "We'll need a sign," she said. He almost smiled. "We'll need a sign," he agreed. They opened the relay station in May, which was earlier than Gideon had originally planned, and about when Maeve had decided was necessary based on her own traffic count and the rate at which the route was being used. She had spent the intervening weeks making a list of what the station needed to function, not as a bare minimum operation, but as something that travelers would actually choose to stop at rather than push through. And then she and Gideon had worked through the list in order of urgency, fixing the roof first, then establishing the storage system, then sourcing the initial stock through Caswell and 2 additional freight contacts she'd developed through the winter correspondence. It was not a smooth opening. The first week they ran short of grain for horses because she'd underestimated the ratio of riders to foot travelers on that particular stretch of trail. She adjusted. The second week, a family stopped and the wife was ill. Not critically, but sick enough to be frightened. And Maeve spent 3 hours with her, working through the symptoms methodically, using what she knew and what she had in her medical stores. The woman recovered. Her husband, a quiet man named Aldrich, shook Maeve's hand when they left with an earnestness that seemed slightly out of proportion until she understood it wasn't. Out here, a sick wife a day's ride from nowhere was not a small thing to have someone manage. Word moved the way it always moved in the territory, faster than the mail and more accurately than anyone expected. By late May, travelers were stopping at the Mercer relay station, not just for supplies, but because they'd been told it was a reliable stop. By June, there were days when Maeve didn't sit down between morning and afternoon. She did not complain about this. She realized, been waiting for exactly this kind of work her whole life, work that was hers, that bore her name in the organizational sense, even if it didn't bear it on any sign, work that used every skill she'd spent years building and asked her to build more. Gideon ran the northern routes with the modified schedule he'd planned, anchoring back to the relay station rather than the homestead, which compressed his route times and made the whole network more efficient. He was, she observed, a genuinely good trader, not in the fast-talking, deal-making way that some men were, but in the way of someone who understood what things were worth and said so directly and kept his word completely, which in this part of the territory was worth more than almost any other quality. He also, she noted, sent people to her. Travelers who needed medical advice, settlers who had questions about supply timing for the coming season, families who were new to the territory and needed someone to explain, plainly and without condescension, what the winter would actually require. He sent them to Maeve, and she handled them, and he never once felt the need to explain or supervise how she handled them. So, the letter from Cold Creek came in June, and it was from Clara. Not Eleanor, Clara. Maeve opened it with some caution, the way you opened something you weren't sure of, and read it standing in the relay station storage room with the afternoon sun coming in sideways through the single window. Clara's handwriting had always been better than her own, rounder, more deliberate. She wrote about Cold Creek, about the trading post, about the fact that Eleanor had finally accepted help from a neighboring merchant family who had offered a partial business arrangement that gave them some stability. She wrote about Harlan Fitch, who she had, Maeve read this twice, apparently decided to begin seeing, a development she described with a mixture of resignation and genuine warmth that Maeve found unexpectedly moving. Then, near the end, Clara wrote, "People talk about you and Mr. Mercer, Maeve, even here. A freight rider came through last month who'd stopped at your station, and he told it like you'd built something remarkable out of nothing. I don't think I believed it at first. I don't mean that unkindly. I mean that I had a certain idea of what was possible for you, and I have been understanding, slowly, that my idea was too small. I'm sorry I was unkind that winter. I wasn't kind to you when you deserved kindness, and I've been carrying that. Write when you can." Maeve folded the letter and held it for a moment. Then she set it carefully in the inner pocket of her coat and went back out to the counter, where a woman in a dusty travel dress was waiting to ask about the road conditions north. She answered the question. She sold the woman a tin of tea and a measure of dried fruit and gave her accurate information about the trail timing. She was useful in all the ways she had always been useful. But the letter was in her pocket, and it stayed there the rest of the day. And she thought about it at intervals in the way you thought about something that had rearranged a small, important part of your understanding of the past. Gideon came back that evening from a short supply run to the Northern Contact, and they ate late at the relay station table, and she told him about Clara's letter. Not all of it, but enough. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. "You going to write back?" he asked. "Yes." "Good." She looked at him. Ruth Packard stopped in today. She and her sister-in-law. Something crossed his face. "The two from the first month." "The same. They stayed for almost an hour." She paused. "Ruth asked me to recommend a medicinal supplier she could contact for her mother. Said she'd heard I was the person to ask." "You are the person to ask," he said simply. 6 months ago, she was coming out here to report back on whether I'd managed to survive the mountain. "People update their assessments when they're given enough evidence," he said. "You gave them evidence." She shook her head slowly. "It's strange," she said, "being seen differently." "Better or worse strange?" She considered. "Neither," she said. "Just strange. Like finding out a road you thought you knew has a different turn than you remembered." She picked up her fork. "I spent a long time not expecting to be seen at all." "I know," Gideon said. He said it without any pride in the fact of having seen her, without making it something about himself. Just, "I know." Acknowledging a thing that was true. She ate. He ate. The lamp burned low between them, and outside the relay station the trail was quiet, and the mountains were dark shapes against a sky full of stars. And somewhere on that trail there were travelers moving toward a point of light that they had been told was reliable, that they could count on, that would be there when they arrived. She had built that. They had built that. Out of a sagging roof and a dead man's abandoned operation, and 20 cents worth of dried venison sold to a trapper who'd asked where Pollard had gotten to. It was not remarkable in any grand sense. It was just what happened when two people who were good at hard things decided to do hard things together, and didn't stop, and didn't look back at what they'd left behind more than was useful. She thought about that, about Clara's letter, about Ruth Packard's question, about the way the Aldrich woman had looked at her when the fever broke and her husband had shaken Maeve's hand, about what it meant to be the person people came to, out of choice, because they had heard she was worth coming to. It was a different thing from being necessary. It was better than being necessary. "The storage needs reorganizing before the summer supply run," she said. "I know. I was going to start on it tomorrow. I have a system." "I assumed you did," he said, with that particular quiet that she had learned to receive as warmth. "I'll show you in the morning." "All right," he said, and they sat together at the relay station table a while longer, while the lamp burned and the mountains kept watch and the trail outside waited patiently for whatever morning would bring. The years did not pass gently in the Wyoming Territory. They passed the way everything passed out there, with weight, with consequence, leaving marks on the people who survived them the way weather left marks on stone. Maeve had stopped counting the winters at some point, not because she'd lost track, but because the counting had stopped being the point. When you were young and uncertain, you counted years the way you counted supplies, measuring what you had against what you needed, always calculating whether there was enough. At some point, without her quite noticing when, she had stopped calculating and started simply living inside the life she had built, the way you stopped noticing the walls of a house you'd lived in long enough. The homestead had changed so completely from what it had been that a person who'd seen it in 1857 would not have recognized it in 1868. What had been a single low cabin with a sagging lean-to was now a proper house. 2 rooms added on, a covered porch on the south side, a barn that Gideon had built the frame for and that 3 neighboring families had helped raise over the course of a single long October weekend 7 years ago, an event that had involved more food than Maeve had ever cooked at one time, and more noise than the property had ever heard. The root cellar was deep and well-sealed and organized in the way that everything Maeve touched eventually became organized, not for the satisfaction of order itself, but because in this place and this life, disorganization cost you things you couldn't afford to lose. There were children. 3 of them, which was 2 more than Maeve had let herself plan for in those early months when she was still measuring everything against worst-case outcomes. Eli was 10, serious and observant in the way that reminded her, sometimes uncomfortably, of herself. Nora was 7 and had her father's economy with words and her mother's ability to take inventory of a room in under a minute. The youngest, Thomas, was 4 and had so far shown no particular resemblance to either of them, which Gideon said privately was probably good for the territory's long-term peace. Maeve did not find motherhood natural in the way that some women seem to. The instinctive ease that made certain women look like they had been designed for exactly this. She found it hard and consuming and occasionally wonderful in ways that ambushed her when she wasn't expecting it. She found herself better at the practical dimensions of it than the soft ones. And she worked at the soft ones the way she worked at everything that didn't come easily. Methodically, with attention, without the pretense that effort was the same as instinct, but with the understanding that effort, sustained long enough, built its own kind of competence. Gideon was a better parent than she had expected him to be, which she had eventually told him, and which had made him look at her with an expression that suggested he wasn't sure whether to be amused or mildly offended. He was patient with the children in the specific way of someone who was not naturally given to patience but had decided it was important, and so made it a practice, the same way he made everything he wasn't born with into a practice. He was not the kind of father who got down on the floor and played games. He was the kind who took Eli with him on short supply runs and answered the boys' questions fully and without simplification, who taught Nora to read trail signs before she could properly read a page, who let Thomas follow him around the yard while he worked and explained what he was doing as he went, as though a 4-year-old's attention deserved the same seriousness as anyone else's. The relay station had grown into something neither of them had quite planned for, which was the way the best things usually went. What had started as a way station, a place to stop, water horses, buy basic provisions, had expanded by necessity and reputation into something closer to a supply depot, and on certain days, a medical post. Maeve's knowledge of frontier medicine, built on her father's almanac and 12 years of practical application, had become known along 200 miles of trail in both directions. She was not a doctor. She had never claimed to be a doctor. But she could assess a wound, manage a fever, set a bone that hadn't shattered, identify the difference between ailments that would resolve with rest and care and ailments that needed the person on a horse heading toward someone with more training than she had. She kept that last category rigorously honest. She had, over the years, sent 3 people away with urgent instructions to reach a physician, and 2 of them had come back later to tell her she'd been right. The third had not come back, which she carried the way she carried everything she couldn't fix, quietly, without putting it down. She had trained 2 women in the basics over the past 4 years. Martha Yunt, the medicine woman from Whitmore Settlement, whose name Gideon had mentioned in those first frightening days of the fever, had come by twice and spent 3 days each time going through what Maeve knew and what she didn't, and filling in gaps with the particular no-nonsense generosity of someone who understood that knowledge hoarded was knowledge that let people die unnecessarily. Martha was 63 and had no patience for sentimentality, which was why she and Maeve had gotten along immediately. "You're better than you give yourself credit for," Martha had said on her second visit, sitting at the relay station table going through Maeve's medical notes. "I'm adequate," Maeve said. "I know the difference." Most people who are only adequate don't know the difference. That's the problem. Martha turned a page. "This notation on the Aldrich woman, what made you think it was a digestive fever rather than the respiratory kind?" Her breathing was normal. The inflammation was in the wrong place. Right, most people would have treated the wrong thing and made it worse. She closed the notebook. "You have good instincts. You've also done the work to know whether your instincts are right. That's the combination." Maeve had not said anything because she was not a person who knew how to receive compliments gracefully. She had filed it away, though, in the place where she kept things that mattered, but that she didn't know what to do with yet. Clara came to visit in the summer of 1863, 6 years after the wedding. She came with Harlan Fitch, who was now her husband of 4 years, a fact that still struck Maeve with a small, involuntary amusement every time she thought about it, given that Clara had spent 2 years treating his attentions as a mild inconvenience. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and Clara had grown into a woman who looked remarkably like the girl Maeve remembered, and very little like her at the same time, Something in the set of her jaw, in the way she moved through a room, had become more deliberate. Less performance, more intention. The visit lasted 5 days, which was long enough for the initial awkwardness to burn off and for something more honest to take its place. The second evening, they sat on the porch while Gideon and Harlan were inside with the children, and Clara looked out at the dark shapes of the mountains and said, "You're happy." "Most days," Maeve said, which was true and more honest than simply yes. "That's better than most days being not." "Yes." Clara was quiet for a while. Then, "I was jealous of you after he chose you. I want to say that plainly because I don't think I ever did." Maeve looked at her. "I know you were." "I was also ashamed of being jealous," Clara continued, "because I thought, I knew somewhere, that it didn't make sense. He wasn't choosing something I had. He was choosing something I never had." She paused. "I didn't understand that at the time. I do now." Maeve thought about the blue dress on that April morning, about Clara's careful positioning near the front counter, about the particular quality of hope that Clara had carried into that room, and how it must have felt to watch it not happen. "I should have been kinder to you," Maeve said, "in those weeks before I left. You were fine. I was distracted." "You were getting married and leaving the only place you'd ever lived," Clara said. "I think distracted is about right." She turned to look at Maeve directly. "I spent a long time being angry at you in a way that I understood even at the time wasn't entirely fair. Anger's easier than the other things." "What were the other things?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "Fear," she said finally, "that if he'd looked past me to you, I must have been missing something real." She shook her head. "It took me a while to figure out that what he'd seen in you wasn't a commentary on me. He was just looking for a specific thing and found it. He was looking for someone who'd already chosen hard things," Maeve said, hearing her own words from that first walk echoed back through years. "Is that what he said?" "First week." Clara made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "He really is unusual, isn't he?" "Thoroughly," Maeve said, and this time she did smile. They sat on the porch until the cold came down from the mountains, and when they went inside, Clara put her arm through Maeve's in the easy, uncomplicated way of two sisters who had gotten somewhere on the other side of an old difficulty, and Maeve let herself lean into it, just briefly, because some things you didn't need to make practical. Eleanor died in the winter of 1865. The trading post had been sold the previous year. Sold well, to the merchant family that had been the partial business partner since Maeve left, and Eleanor had spent her last year in Clara's house, which was, by all accounts, where she had wanted to be. Maeve had made it back to Cold Creek twice in the intervening years, difficult trips both times, and she had seen her mother in a condition that was declining but not yet urgent. She had thought there would be more time. There was not more time. There rarely was. The letter came through Caswell and reached her 3 weeks after Eleanor was already buried, which meant there was nothing to be done about the burial and nothing to be done about the 3 weeks of not knowing. And Maeve sat with that fact in the way she sat with most things she couldn't change, without struggling against it, because struggling against an immovable thing was just a way of injuring yourself for no purpose. What she sat with longer, in the evenings and the weeks after the letter came, was the accounting of their relationship, the full, honest ledger of it, not the simplified version where Eleanor had been either a good mother or a bad one, but the complicated true version, where she had been a frightened woman in an impossible situation who had made calculations that Maeve had resented and who had also held her tight at a wagon in Cold Creek and said, "You write? You send letters when you can." Who had pressed supplies on her that she couldn't spare. Who had written letters in that careful formal hand that never quite said the emotional thing directly but always said the practical one, which Maeve had come to understand over the years, was her mother's version of the same impulse. She cried once, alone in the relay station storage room on an afternoon when Gideon was on the northern route and the children were at the homestead with the neighbor woman who helped when Maeve needed to work. She cried in the way she did most difficult things, thoroughly and without an audience, and then she washed her face and went back to work because the work was there and she was the person who did it. Gideon came back 2 days later and knew, immediately, the way he knew most things about her without being told. He didn't make a speech. He sat down across the table from her that evening and said, Tell me something about her, something I didn't know. And Maeve told him about her mother's handwriting and the way she rearranged small objects when she was anxious, and the time she'd stayed up an entire night helping Maeve repair a water-damaged shipment of goods 3 days before her father's creditors were due to call, working silently and efficiently beside her daughter without complaint, and how that had been, Maeve thought, one of the most honest expressions of love her mother had ever managed. Gideon listened without interrupting. At the end, he said, "She sounds like you." "She was nothing like me." "She was exactly like you," he said quietly. "She showed up through the work because the work was what she knew how to do." "That's you." Maeve looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was burning low. Outside, the Wyoming night was very quiet, the way it got in November when the wind dropped and the cold settled in and everything went still. "I've been thinking," she said after a while, "that I should have gone back more." "You went when you could. It wasn't enough." "No," he said. "It probably wasn't." He didn't soften it because he knew her well enough to know that she didn't want it softened. "You also had this, the children, the station, the roots. None of that would have run itself." "I know." "She knew too," he said. "From what you've told me about her, she knew." Maeve was quiet. Then, "She told me when I left that I should write." "And you wrote?" "Every month." "Then she knew where you were," Gideon said. "She knew what you were doing. She knew you were all right." He paused. "Some people don't get that." She nodded slowly. "It was not a resolution exactly. It was more like a reframing. The difference between the thing you didn't do and the thing you did do, and the recognition that the second column had more in it than grief was willing to acknowledge. She would carry the loss the way she carried everything, but she would not let it become a verdict." What? The territory changed around them in ways that were sometimes astonishing and sometimes simply exhausting. More settlers came west every year, and the trail that had once been a rough path between isolated outposts had become a genuine artery, rutted and busy and lined at intervals with operations like theirs, small nodes of civilization that collectively made the passage possible for the families and merchants and adventurers who kept arriving with their loaded wagons and their unprepared optimism. The Mercer Relay Station was one of the older ones now, which gave it a reputation that newer outfits had to earn. People knew the name. People told other people. In 1866, a man named Aldrich, the same Aldrich whose wife Maeve had treated 6 years earlier, came through heading east and stopped for a full day, not because he needed supplies, but because he had a proposition. He was part of a small consortium of established traders who were organizing a formal supply network for the northern Wyoming routes, and they wanted the Mercer Station as a hub. He laid the proposal out at the relay station table. A full hour of careful explanation with numbers and maps and projected volumes. And when he was done, he looked at Maeve, not at Gideon, at Maeve, and said, "We need someone who understands how supply actually moves on the ground, someone who knows what breaks down and why, not just on paper but in practice. That's you, Mrs. Mercer." She looked at the maps. She looked at the numbers. "The storage capacity would need to triple," she said. "We have capital available for that. And I would want final say on inventory decisions. I won't be overruled by people sitting in an office who've never spent a winter out here." "That's a reasonable condition," Aldrich said. "We'd want it in writing." "So would I," she said. Gideon, who had sat through the entire conversation without speaking, said at this point, "I have 2 questions." Aldrich looked at him. "Who else is in the consortium?" Gideon said. "And are any of them people I wouldn't trust with a lame horse?" Aldrich named 4 names. Gideon considered them, one by one, with the particular assessment of a man who had been doing business in the territory for 15 years and had strong opinions based on evidence. "Calloway's reliable," he said finally. "Marsh has been known to shade his numbers. The other 2 I don't know well enough." He looked at Maeve. "Your call." She appreciated that. Not the abdication of it. He had offered his assessment, but the understanding that the call on this was hers to make. She made it. She negotiated 3 conditions in addition to the storage clause, wrote them out in her own hand, and signed the agreement 6 days later when Aldrich came back through with the consortium's counter-signatures. The expanded station was built over the course of the following spring and summer. It was not a smooth process. There were disputes about materials, delays in delivery, one genuinely difficult week when the framing crew from the Eastern settlement turned out to be 4 men short of what they'd promised, and Gideon spent a day making calls on every available hand within a day's ride. But it got built, the way things got built out here, through persistence and adjustment and the willingness to solve the problem that was actually in front of you, rather than the one you'd planned for. Eli was 17 the summer the expansion finished, and he had been working at the station seriously for 2 years by then, learning the supply side from Maeve and the trade routes from his father with the focused attention of someone who understood that he was being handed something real and intended to deserve it. One evening that summer, after a long day of inventory work that had run past sunset, Eli sat at the station table going over his notes and said, without looking up, "People ask me sometimes how you ended up out here." Maeve was at the shelf, returning tins to their places. "What people?" "Travelers, settlers, people stopping through." He looked up. "They know the name. They want to know the story." "What do you tell them?" He considered. "I tell them Dad came to Cold Creek looking for someone practical enough for the frontier and found you." "That's accurate." "Is it the whole story?" She set the last tin in place and turned around to look at her son. He had Gideon's steadiness, and she suspected more of her interior complexity than he yet knew what to do with. That combination of calculation and feeling that she had spent most of her own life managing. "No," she said, "but it's the part that was the beginning." "What's the rest?" She thought about that for a moment, about the blue dress and the wedding in the front room of the trading post and the 2 trunks in the wagon bed and the road west, about 6 days in a fever with a man in a chair outside the door, about a map spread on a table and a sagging roof and a trapper who paid 10 cents for dried venison and rode on, about Clara on a porch saying I was jealous of you and Eleanor's careful, formal handwriting, and Martha Yunt saying you have good instincts. "The rest," she said slowly, "is that I came out here believing I understood exactly what this was. A practical arrangement between 2 practical people." She paused. "I was right about the practical part. I was wrong about the exactly." Eli looked at her, waiting. "Most things worth having don't fit inside the reason you first had for getting them," she said. "You start somewhere small, something manageable, something you can measure. And if you're willing to do the work and stay honest about what you find, you end up somewhere you couldn't have planned for." She looked at him. "That's not a comfortable way to live, but it's the real way." He was quiet, thinking about it the way he thought about most things, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion. "Is that what you'd tell people?" he said, "if they asked?" "I don't tell people much," she said, which was true, "but that's what I'd tell you." Gideon was 51 that fall, and for the first time in the 15 years Maeve had known him, the northern route runs were beginning to show in him in ways that hadn't been there before. A stiffness in the mornings, a slower recovery from the hard trips. He did not complain. He would not complain. She had long since stopped expecting him to complain and had instead developed the habit of watching for the signs he wouldn't name and adjusting accordingly. She had begun transitioning more of the route planning to Eli and to a young trader named Prentice who had been working with Gideon for 3 years and had earned a level of trust that Gideon extended slowly and entirely. The conversation with Gideon about this had been, characteristically, direct. "You're not retiring," she told him the evening she raised it. "I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying the overnight mountain passes in January are a 20-year-old man's work. I've been doing them since I was 26. And you're not 26. He looked at her across the table. "Neither are you." "No, but I'm not sleeping in snow shelters at elevation in February. I use a proper camp." "Gideon?" She set her pen down. "I need you here for the long run. I need you functional for the next 20 years, not worn down to nothing by 55 because you refuse to let anyone else take the February passes." He was quiet for a moment. In the 15 years of their marriage, she had learned to read his silences the way she read weather signs, the quality of them, the length of them, what they meant and didn't mean. This one meant he was not going to argue, which was not the same as being convinced, but was the thing that happened when Gideon Mercer acknowledged that an argument had merit, even if he didn't like it. Prentice knows the North Fork route, he said finally. He does. I'll need to go with him twice more before I'd trust him on it alone. That seems reasonable. Another silence. Then, I don't like getting older. Neither do I, she said, but we're doing it, so we might as well do it right. He looked at her with the expression she had come to know better than any other over the years. That particular quality of attention he gave to things he valued, the flat, honest regard that had once seemed like blankness and had turned out to be the opposite. It was how he looked at the mountains when he was reading them for weather. It was how he looked at the trail when he was deciding whether it was safe. It was how he looked at her, and had been looking at her, she thought, since the morning he stood in the trading post holding his hat and asked to speak to the sister with the bad leg. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. Listen, the station was busy on the October morning that Ruth Packard came through for the last time. She was older now, her hair mostly white, making a trip east to stay with her daughter's family and leaving the Wyoming territory behind for good. She stopped at the station with 2 trunks and a traveling companion and bought provisions for the road. And when Maeve came out from the back to help with a stock question, Ruth looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was doing several things at once. I want to say something, Ruth said. I said some things about you years ago, when Mr. Mercer when he made his choice, things I'm not proud of. Maeve looked at her. She remembered Mildred Crane's words at the dry goods store, half recalled through years. She thought about Harlan Fitch's bewildered face. She thought about the first walk with Gideon along the south fence line and what she had understood in herself that morning, even if she hadn't said it, that other people's assessments of her had always been wrong, not because they were cruel, but because they had looked at the surface and stopped there, at the leg, the hands, the useful, unmarriageable older daughter, and decided they already knew what they were seeing. She had spent years being shaped by that knowledge without being diminished by it, which was the harder of the 2 things and the one that mattered. You don't need to say anything, Ruth, she said. It was a long time ago. I want to say it anyway, Ruth said. I was wrong about what I thought I was seeing. What you and Mr. Mercer built out here, what you've done. I want you to know that people have talked about it. People still talk about it. She paused. You became someone people point to. When someone says a thing can't be done out here, or a woman can't manage this or that, you're the example. Maeve was quiet. I don't say this to flatter you, Ruth said. I say it because I was one of the people who thought it couldn't be done, and I was wrong, and I think someone should say that plainly to your face. I appreciate that, Maeve said, which was the truest thing she could manage. Ruth paid for her provisions and left with her companion, heading east, and Maeve watched the wagon move down the trail until it was small and then gone. She stood in the station doorway for a moment in the October morning. The mountains to the west, the trail in both directions, the sound of Nora inside arguing with Thomas over something that wasn't yet worth intervening on. The cold was coming. She could feel it in the particular way the air had sharpened overnight, the way the light had flattened to that hard autumnal quality that meant the easy season was nearly done. There was a long winter ahead. There was always a long winter ahead. She had the lists. She had the inventory. She had 11 years of understanding exactly what this place required and exactly what she could give it. She had a husband who had stayed in a chair for 6 days when staying was the only thing he had left to offer, and who had been looking at her in the same way since the morning she'd walked along a fence line and answered his questions plainly, and who had, without announcement or ceremony, built a life with her out of the belief that she was worth building it with. She had children who were becoming people she respected. She had work that bore her name in the way that mattered, not on a sign, but in the knowledge of everyone who had ever stopped here and found what they needed and moved on. She had been the woman everyone overlooked. She had lived inside that fact for most of her life, and she knew its dimensions better than anyone, knew the particular shape of being looked past, of being useful without being seen, of being the one who held things together in the quiet while someone else stood in the light. She knew it, and she did not regret it exactly because it had made her into someone who understood real value from the inside out, not the outside in. Someone who knew the difference between being necessary and being wanted and who had eventually managed to have both. The territory had not given her anything, Nothing out here was given. You built what you built with what you had, and you stayed honest about what it cost, and you didn't stop. That was all. That was the whole of it. She went back inside to finish the morning work. Because the morning work was waiting, and she was the person who did it. And outside, the Wyoming sky was enormous and indifferent and very blue. And the mountains stood where they had always stood, keeping their own counsel, asking nothing from the people who lived in their shadow except that they be equal to the life they had chosen. Maeve Mercer was equal to it. She had been equal to it from the beginning. It had just taken the world a little while to notice.